In July of 1945, the most powerful weapon ever built already existed. The man who would decide its use had been president for less than 4 months. Harry Truman did not create the atomic bomb. He did not authorize its development. He did not even know it existed until weeks before he was asked to decide how it would be used. Germany was already defeated. The war everyone expected to end had ended, and yet the war Truman inherited was about to become even more destructive. This is where the story is usually simplified. Truman faced a single choice, we're told, and chose annihilation. The reality is colder. He inherited a weapon built for one enemy, a war that refused to end against another, and a system already conditioned to accept mass civilian death as strategy. The decision history remembers was not made in a vacuum. It was made inside momentum. By the time Truman learned what the Manhattan Project had created, the question was no longer whether the bomb should exist. It was whether anything could stop the war before the invasion began, and whether the cost of stopping it would permanently change what war itself meant. On April 25, 1945, Truman was brought into a private briefing. There were no cameras, no ceremony, no dramatic reveal. He was told of a weapon that released energy from the atom itself, a bomb with unprecedented power, a project so secret that even the vice president had been excluded. The briefing did not come with a moral debate. It came with logistics. The Manhattan Project had cost $2 billion. Hundreds of thousands of people had worked on it. The weapon was nearly ready, and the war was not ending. By the time Truman arrived in Potsdam in July, the strategic picture had narrowed. Allied leaders gathered to decide the post-war order, but beneath the diplomacy ran a darker current. American planners were finalizing Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Casualty estimates varied wildly. Some were optimistic, many were not. What united them was scale. This would not be a clean victory. It would be a grinding, amphibious assault against a population prepared to resist to the end. On Okinawa, civilians had jumped from cliffs rather than surrender. Kamikaze attacks had continued long after defeat was certain. Every battle seemed to confirm a grim pattern. Japan fought hardest when defeat was inevitable. This was the world Truman inherited. At Potsdam, Truman received word that the atomic bomb test in New Mexico had succeeded. The weapon worked, not theoretically, not eventually, now. There was no public announcement, no immediate order, just a shift in leverage. Truman mentioned a powerful new weapon to Stalin in passing. Stalin nodded. He already knew. The assumption that Truman was eager to use the bomb collapses under scrutiny. He did not speak like a man intoxicated by power. He spoke like a man trying to end a war that refused to end. But urgency was tightening the frame. Japan's leadership was fractured. Some wanted negotiation. Others demanded conditions that preserved the emperor's authority and avoided occupation. The United States demanded unconditional surrender. Neither side blinked. The firebombing of Tokyo had already killed more people than the atomic bomb would in its immediate aftermath. Cities across Japan had been reduced to ash by conventional weapons. The line between total war and annihilation had already been crossed. The bomb did not introduce moral shock, it introduced speed. This is the first contradiction that matters. The atomic bomb is remembered as a moral rupture, but it emerged inside a system that had already normalized mass civilian death. Truman did not invent that system. He was operating within it. If you imagine Truman staring at a red button, wrestling with conscience in isolation, you are missing the real pressure. The pressure came from momentum, from plans already written, from a war that had trained everyone involved to measure success in numbers, not ideals. Truman was not choosing between peace and destruction. He was choosing between ways of ending destruction. Here is the insight that rarely survives retelling. Presidents do not inherit blank slates. They inherit trajectories. And the most powerful decisions are often about whether to interrupt them. The bomb offered interruption. But interruption has costs you cannot fully see in advance. Within Truman's administration, the question was not whether to use the bomb. It was how. Demonstration or deployment. Warning or surprise. Military target or city. Each option solved one problem and created another. A demonstration might fail. A warning might give time to move prisoners of war. A delay might cost tens of thousands of lives on the battlefield. Every alternative carried blood. No historian can prove what would have happened had Truman chosen differently. But that uncertainty is not evidence of recklessness. It is evidence of constraint. Truman did not have the luxury of moral purity. He had responsibility. Responsibility meant ending the war. Responsibility meant bringing soldiers home. Responsibility meant acting before the invasion began and before the Soviet Union entered the Pacific War, reshaping Asia's future in ways no one could control. The bomb was not just a weapon, it was a clock, and it was ticking. If you place yourself in Truman's position, strip away hindsight, and remove the moral vocabulary that only exists after the fact, the question becomes sharper and more uncomfortable. How much destruction is acceptable if it prevents even greater destruction later? That is not a question anyone wants to answer, but in July of 1945 someone had to. Truman delayed his final authorization until the last possible moment. When he approved the use of the bomb, he did not frame it as an experiment, a warning, or a threat. He framed it as a military action intended to end a war. What followed would reshape the world. But the decision itself was forged in a narrower space, under heavier weight than the myth allows. The bomb would soon fall, and once it did, there would be no return to the world Truman briefly inhabited, where the future was still undefined, and the worst consequences had not yet revealed themselves. By the summer of 1945, the war was no longer being fought only on battlefields. It was being fought inside conference rooms, telegrams, and fractured chains of command. Japan was not a single voice speaking surrender or defiance. It was a system locked in paralysis. The emperor remained distant, revered, and deliberately insulated. Civilian leaders searched for a way out without humiliation. Military leaders prepared for a final defense that assumed annihilation, but rejected surrender. No faction had enough power to break the deadlock. This is where the American view hardened. Intelligence intercepts revealed desperate diplomacy aimed at Moscow. Japan hoped the Soviet Union might broker a negotiated peace. The problem was timing. The Soviets had already promised the Allies they would enter the war against Japan, and they were preparing to do exactly that. For Truman, this was not abstract strategy. It was a narrowing corridor. If Japan surrendered before Soviet entry, the war would end under American terms. If it did not, Asia's future would fracture under competing occupations and ideologies. The bomb was no longer just about ending the war. Yeah, it was about ending it first. At the same time, the invasion plans became more concrete. Operation Olympic was scheduled for November. Operation Coronet would follow in the spring. American commanders did not need to exaggerate casualties. They only needed to look at the pattern. Each island campaign had grown more lethal. Each defeat had produced fiercer resistance. Each month of delay multiplied the dead. This is the second contradiction. The closer Japan came to defeat, the more violent the end was likely to be. Inside the US government, dissent existed, but it did not align neatly with later moral arguments. Some scientists urged caution. Others believed use was inevitable. Military leaders disagreed about tactics, but not objectives. The objective was surrender. There was no serious expectation that Japan would surrender because it was warned. The firebombing campaign had already erased dozens of cities. The logic of shock had been exhausted. What remained was finality. Truman's decision space shrank further when the bomb was framed not as a question of whether it should be used, but whether it should be used decisively. A single bomb might not be enough. A failed strike could embolden resistance. A demonstration could appear as weakness. The weapon had to speak clearly. This is the insight that unsettles most modern audiences. The atomic bomb was used not because it was new, but because it fit perfectly into an existing logic of total war. The war had already taught its leaders that half measures prolonged suffering. On August 6th, Hiroshima was destroyed. The city was a military and industrial centre, but it was also a living place. Families, children, workers. In seconds, tens of thousands were killed. Many more would die later. The Japanese government did not surrender. 3 days passed. Confusion reigned. Information was fragmented. Some leaders doubted the nature of the weapon. Others argued that one bomb did not change the strategic reality. Then the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria. On August 9th, Nagasaki was destroyed. This sequence matters. The bomb did not act alone. It collided with a geopolitical shock Japan had spent months trying to avoid. Now the system broke. The Emperor intervened. For the first time, he spoke directly to end the war. The decision bypassed military resistance and imposed surrender from above. This is where narratives often simplify. The bomb forced surrender, or the Soviets forced surrender. The truth is more uncomfortable. It took multiple shocks to collapse a system built to resist reality. Truman did not know this outcome in advance. He could not have. But he understood the nature of the pressure he was applying. And here is the line that history rarely lingers on. The bomb did not end war because it was terrifying. It ended war because it removed the last illusion of control. Once surrender came, Truman faced a different kind of responsibility. How to justify what had been done. How to frame it for a public that had not yet seen the images. How to ensure the weapon did not become a routine tool of power. He spoke carefully. He emphasized lives saved. He emphasized finality. He did not dwell on suffering. This idea still shapes how modern leaders talk about catastrophic decisions. They speak in numbers, not faces. Outcomes, not process. If you pause here and ask whether you would have chosen differently, you are asking the wrong question. The better question is whether any leader, placed inside that system, could have escaped its logic. Truman approved a weapon that redefined the ceiling of violence. He did so to end a war that had erased every previous limit. But in doing so, he crossed a line no one could ever uncross. And the world would spend the rest of the century trying to live on the far side of it, uncertain whether the decision had prevented a future of endless war or merely postponed its most dangerous form. The surrender ended the war, but it did not end the consequences of the decision. Those arrived slowly, then all at once. In the weeks after Japan capitulated, the world did not yet grasp what had changed. The bomb was treated as a larger explosion, not a new category of power. Truman himself initially spoke of it as an extension of artillery, terrible but bounded. That assumption would not survive contact with reality. Reports from Hiroshima and Nagasaki filtered in unevenly. At first they focused on blast damage, then burns, then radiation sickness, a phenomenon no military doctrine had prepared anyone to explain. People who survived the explosion died days later for no visible reason. Doctors were baffled. Commanders were silent. The weapon had not just killed. It had rewritten cause and effect. This is where Truman's confidence began to fracture. He had approved the bomb to end a war, not to inaugurate an era. Yet almost immediately the implications outran the justification. If this weapon existed, it would not remain singular. Others would build it, faster than expected. Within weeks, intelligence confirmed that the Soviet Union was accelerating its own program. The monopoly Truman briefly possessed was already eroding. The bomb had solved one problem permanently and created another without an endpoint. Inside the White House, the tone shifted. Truman no longer spoke about atomic weapons casually. He began to distance himself from their operational use. When discussions turned to future deployments, he drew lines that had not existed before. He told advisors that the atomic bomb was not a military weapon in the conventional sense. He rejected proposals that treated it as just another tool in the arsenal. This mattered, not because it erased what had happened, but because it revealed something essential about Truman's character. He was capable of decisive action, but he was not indifferent to consequence. The strongest critique of Truman is not that he failed to foresee the future. No one could. It is that he underestimated how quickly the future would arrive. By 1949, the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb. The era of American singularity ended abruptly. The logic Truman had briefly controlled now escaped him. The decision that ended one war became the foundation of a standoff that threatened all wars at once. This is the fault line that runs beneath the entire story. The atomic bomb did not just end World War II. It reorganized how leaders thought about power, restraint and survival. And Truman felt that weight personally. He approved the development of the hydrogen bomb, a weapon far more powerful than anything used in Japan, despite deep misgivings. He did so not out of enthusiasm, but fear. Fear that restraint on one side would invite domination by the other. This is the third contradiction. The man who recoiled from atomic warfare helped escalate it. Not because he wanted to, but because the system he had entered rewarded preemption over hesitation. If you listen carefully to Truman's later remarks, You hear a narrowing patience. He grew blunt, suspicious of generals who spoke too easily about targets, resistant to abstraction. He had seen what abstraction produced. One moment captures this shift with unusual clarity. During the Korean War, when military leaders discussed the possible use of atomic weapons, Truman reacted sharply. He removed a general who had spoken publicly about expanding the war and made clear that nuclear use would not be delegated. The authority would remain with him. This was not symbolism, it was containment. The decision in 1945 had taught Truman something few leaders ever learn in time: that the most dangerous weapons are not those that require cruelty, but those that make cruelty efficient. Efficiency seduces institutions. It bypasses debate. It compresses decision-making until moral friction disappears. Truman began to resist that compression. Here is a reflection worth sitting with. Ending a war does not end the responsibility for how it was ended. That responsibility accumulates. It changes future decisions. It narrows what you can pretend not to know. Truman never publicly expressed regret in the way many expect. He defended the decision to his death, but defense is not the same as comfort. The absence of regret does not imply the absence of cost. His presidency became defined not by the bomb itself, but by managing its aftermath. Containment, deterrence, alliances, red lines. A world built not on trust, but on fear, calibrated to avoid annihilation. The bomb forced leaders to imagine consequences beyond victory. That was new, and it was destabilizing. Empires before had collapsed when their systems stopped adapting. This one survived by adapting too far too fast into a posture where peace depended on the permanent readiness for extinction. Truman did not design that outcome, but he stood at its entrance. And here is the unresolved tension that history cannot close cleanly. If Truman had not used the bomb, would the world be safer today, or simply ignorant of how dangerous it already was? That question has no proof, only perspective. What is certain is that the decision revealed limits that had always existed. Limits on control, limits on foresight, limits on the idea that power can be exercised without reshaping the rules that govern it. Truman's choice ended a war and began a condition. One that future presidents would inherit the same way he had inherited his own moment, abruptly, under pressure, with fewer options than they appeared to have. The story does not resolve here, because the true consequence of the decision was not destruction, it was permanence. And once permanence enters history, there is no clean way back. There is a moment when decisions stop being reversible, even in theory. For Harry Truman, that moment did not arrive with Hiroshima. It arrived when the world began reorganizing itself around the weapon he had authorized. By the late 1940s, the atomic bomb was no longer a singular horror. It was a reference point. Every treaty, every alliance, every crisis now bent around its gravity. Strategy was rewritten, diplomacy hardened, silence itself became a signal. Truman watched this transformation unfold in real time. What unsettled him most was not the weapon's power, but how quickly it normalized. Military planners spoke of yields and delivery systems. Politicians spoke of balance. The language drained the blood from the reality. This was the danger he could not ignore. In private, Truman resisted any framing that treated nuclear weapons as usable instruments of policy. He insisted they remain exceptional, controlled, personal. He refused to delegate authority. He refused to make their use routine. That refusal marked the point of no return. Because once a weapon requires constant restraint to prevent catastrophe, the system using it is already unstable. The Korean War exposed this instability. When conflict erupted on the peninsula, it tested every assumption built since 1945. The United States faced a conventional war under the shadow of nuclear escalation. The temptation to resolve stalemate through overwhelming force returned immediately. Truman said no, not quietly, not ambiguously. He made it clear that nuclear weapons would not be used to solve tactical problems. When a senior general publicly suggested expanding the war and hinted at atomic options, Truman removed him without hesitation. This was not weakness, it was memory. Truman understood something that abstract theory often misses. Once nuclear use becomes acceptable in one context, it becomes imaginable in all contexts. The line only works if it is absolute. but absolutes are hard to defend in a world built on fear. The irony sharpened. Truman, the man forever associated with the bomb's first use, became its most immediate restrainer. He had seen what others had not. That the weapon's greatest danger was not a single detonation, but the habits it would create. Deterrence sounds stable. In practice, it is permanent brinkmanship. Every crisis now carried a hidden multiplier. Miscalculation no longer meant defeat, it meant annihilation. Truman grasped this before the doctrine had a name. Here is the insight that reframes the story. The atomic age did not begin with power. It began with vulnerability. For the first time, the strongest nations were also the most exposed. Victory no longer guaranteed survival. Dominance no longer ensured safety. Truman had ended one war by introducing a weapon that made total war impossible without ending civilization itself. That contradiction could not be resolved. It could only be managed, and management required constant discipline. The problem was that discipline could not be inherited reliably. Each new leader would face pressures Truman could not control. Different personalities, different incentives, different thresholds for risk. The system assumed rational actors forever. History offers no such guarantee. Truman sensed this fragility. He worried about what would happen when memory faded and abstraction took over. When Hiroshima became a lesson rather than a wound. That fear haunted his later years. He did not seek to undo the past. He sought to contain it. Arms control, alliances, restraint. These were not idealistic gestures. They were damage control. Still, the arms race accelerated. Each side justified escalation as defense. Each new weapon was framed as a stabilizer. Each step forward narrowed the margin for error. The point of no return was not technological, it was psychological. Once humanity proved it could destroy itself in minutes, every future conflict carried that knowledge. You cannot unlearn extinction. If you search for a moment where Truman could have stepped off this path, you will not find one. The path closed behind him the instant the bomb worked. This is why the decision remained so difficult to judge. Not because it lacks moral weight, but because its consequences were not linear. They compounded. Truman ended World War II, but he also inaugurated a condition where peace depended on mutual terror and restraint. That condition has held, imperfectly, for generations. Whether that is success or failure depends on what you compare it to. What matters is that after 1945, the world no longer asked whether the war could be won. It asked whether war could be survived. That question reshaped everything, and Truman, more than any single individual, stood at the threshold where that shift became irreversible. Not because he wanted to redefine humanity's future, but because history placed that burden on him without appeal. There was no precedent to follow, no template to consult, only responsibility applied under pressure, with consequences that could not be recalled. The finality of the atomic decision was not its violence, it was its permanence. From that moment on, every leader would inherit a narrower world, one where mistakes could no longer be localized, one where restraint mattered more than ambition. Truman understood this before most. He carried it quietly. He enforced it when he could. And he left office knowing the system he helped create would test every successor in ways no election could prepare them for. The bomb did not just end a war, it locked history into a new phase. And once locked, the only question left was whether humanity could live inside it without breaking. History prefers verdicts, guilty or justified, necessary or monstrous. But Harry Truman's decision resists that kind of closure. Not because the facts are unclear, but because the consequences refuse to stay still. By the time Truman left office, the atomic bomb had faded from a singular event into a permanent condition. It no longer belonged to 1945. It belonged to every future crisis, every warning, every silence between rivals who understood exactly what was at stake. Truman spent his final years defending the decision in public, yet his actions as president told a more complex story. He centralized control. He rejected normalization. He resisted casual talk of nuclear use with visible anger. These were not the habits of a man untroubled by what he had done. They were the habits of someone who understood that a line once crossed must never become routine. This is where the legacy sharpens. Truman did not just authorize the bomb. He defined how it would be remembered and constrained. He framed it as a last resort, not precedent. A boundary, not a baseline. That framing would echo through decades of policy, doctrine, and hesitation. It is easy to miss how fragile that inheritance was. Deterrence held not because it was foolproof, but because leaders kept believing the cost of failure was absolute. Truman's generation carried memory. Later generations carried doctrine. The difference matters. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. Would the nuclear taboo exist if the first use had been casual, repeated, or tactically convenient? Almost certainly not. Truman's insistence on finality shaped that taboo. This is the shareable truth that cuts through the noise. The most important nuclear decision in history may not have been using the bomb, but refusing to use it again. That refusal did not undo Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Nothing could. But it prevented their logic from spreading unchecked. Critics are right about one thing. Truman's choice inflicted unimaginable suffering. That suffering deserves clarity, not abstraction. It deserves remembrance without justification or erasure. Supporters are also right about something essential. The war ended. Millions did not die in an invasion that would have consumed both sides. The conflict closed instead of metastasizing. Both truths coexist. Any account that denies one in favor of the other is incomplete. What makes Truman's decision enduring is not that it was perfect, but that it revealed something permanent about leadership under extreme constraint. Power does not arrive with guidance. It arrives with responsibility before understanding. Truman never asked to define the atomic age. He inherited a war, a weapon, and a narrowing window. He acted, then spent the rest of his presidency trying to prevent the consequences from outrunning control. That is not a clean arc. It is a human one. If you expect historical figures to be either villains or heroes, Truman will disappoint you. If you expect them to be constrained, pressured, and forced to decide with incomplete knowledge, he becomes unavoidably familiar. This is the final reflection worth carrying forward. Judging the past is easier than recognizing how often we benefit from decisions we would condemn if we had to make them ourselves. Truman lived with that contradiction openly. He did not retreat from it. He did not romanticize it. He absorbed it. The atomic bomb did not make Truman powerful. It exposed how limited power truly is when consequences become irreversible. In the end, his legacy is not the mushroom cloud. It is the restraint that followed it. A world that has avoided nuclear war for decades is not an accident. It is the cumulative result of leaders choosing, again and again, not to repeat the decision Truman made once. Whether that restraint will hold forever is an open question. History offers no guarantees, only precedents, and Truman's precedent remains stark. When faced with a choice that reshaped humanity's ceiling for violence, he acted to end a war, then spent his remaining authority trying to ensure the weapon he unleashed would never become ordinary. That is not absolution. It is accountability stretched across time. The decision cannot be undone. The consequences cannot be unseen. But the lesson remains active. Some choices end conflicts. Others define the world that follows. Harry Truman made one that did both.